Hi, my name is Jason Garfoot, and I'm an application engineer here at 3M. Today we're bringing you a brand new standard operating procedure series. This one is on the feather prime and block procedure. Before we jump in, I'm going to give you a quick overview of the feather prime and block procedure. The first thing we want to do is a visual inspection of our repair area to make sure it's up to the quality that we need. We're going to feather edge out our repair area around the body filler and make sure we take care of any inline scratches and get those sanded out before we prime. Once we get everything prepped, we're going to clean and mask the area, and then we'll move it into the booth and apply our primer. Once our primer is applied and cured, we'll bring this panel back out and finish our repair by sanding the area and prepping it for paint. So the first step is to do a visual inspection of the repair area. The key things we want to look for is the feather edge and the body filler to make sure it was mixed and applied properly. We don't want to see too much hardener in the body filler. We want to see a nice, in this case, light blue color. If you're using a body filler that has a red hardener, it should have a faint red hue to it. We want to make sure there's not too much hardener in, or it could compromise the repair later on. The other thing we want to check and see is that we have a nice clean area of metal around our body filler and not touching our actual feather edge. The reason is, if body filler is applied over our painted edge, the styrene in body fillers can react with the paint and cause it to swell. After our primer application and we've sanded everything smooth, that area will shrink back down and could result in repair mapping. So we want to make sure we have a nice clean metal ring around our body filler. The next thing I want to inspect is look for any pinholes or inline scratches. In this case, there's inline scratches left from the blocking process. So the next thing we're going to want to do is apply guide coat to fill in any of those sand scratches, and then we'll use a DA with the proper sandpaper for your paint company recommendations and finish sanding out those sand scratches and leave a nice area for primer. The primer we're going to be using today calls for us to finish this repair with 400 grit paper on a DA. So I'm going to get my PPE on, get this thing guide coated, and get it prepped. It's important in any sanding procedure to make sure we're using dry guide coat. In this case, we're going to use the dry guide coat to highlight any of those inline scratches or possible pinholes that I may have missed during the visual inspection. All I'm going to do is turn the guide coat upside down to load the pad with powder, spin it to remove any excess, and then all I have to do is lightly rub this onto the whole repair area, anywhere that blocking may have occurred and anywhere I want to prime. Again, this is going to help highlight any of the sand scratches as I start to sand this with the DA. Now I'm going to put on my respirator and grab my DA with 400 grit paper and sand this area down until all the sand scratches are removed. Because I used dry guide coat, it was very easy to see my inline scratches as I started to use the DA. At this point, if your primer calls out the use of a finer sandpaper than what we use, you would reapply guide coat before you sand again, just to make sure you get any of those coarser DA scratches out of the panel. I'm now going to check over my feather edge, which actually looks pretty good in this case. If you had areas that weren't feathered out enough, this would be the time to use that finer paper and continue to sand those edges until we get a nice smooth taper. Some people worry about leaving exposed metal because they think the primer will not fill the feather edge from the old paint that's been sanded down. Most primers today fill all the way up to 10 mils thick, which is much thicker than any OEM coating. So let the primer fill this feather edge area and don't do that with body filler. Again, the chemicals in most body fillers can cause that paint edge to actually swell and show up after our repair in the form of repair mapping. Our inspection looks really good, so now what we can do is final sand to prep for our primer application. So what I'm going to do is apply a little bit more guide coat because I'm going to switch to a slightly finer paper, and I'm going to sand out just beyond the repair area to make sure I have plenty of room to mask and not leave any shiny spots left where primer could land. We want everything to be scuffed and dull for proper adhesion. So I'm going to get my respirator back on, finish sanding this area, and then we'll be ready to clean it and get it masked up. Now that I've final sanded my area, it's time to do one more quick visual inspection. As I was sanding, I was keeping an eye for pinholes and inline scratches, which again the dry guide coat helps tremendously with. But now that I've sanded everything, I want to do one last inspection to see if I missed anything, and that usually shows up in the form of shiny spots, typically around a body line like this. I got my area pretty well, so we're ready to move on to the next step. But if you had any shiny spots below a body line, at that time it's good to use something like a Scotch-Brite pad, scuff that area to make sure it's not shiny anymore, and because we scuffed it, we put in inline scratches, so we just want to run over it one more time with the DA quick to make sure we get out any of those inline scratches. But this looks good, so the next thing we can do is clean it and get it ready to mask. So if you noticed as I was cleaning the panel, I sprayed my wax and grease remover on a rag and then wiped the panel with that white rag and followed it up with a dry rag. We never want to spray any wax and grease remover, whether it's waterborne or solvent-borne, directly on the body filler, as body filler is porous and will absorb that. If we don't get it all out before we prime, we can end up trapping those solvents inside, and they'll eventually come out after the repair has been completed and can show up in the form of micropop, a dulling clear coat, or even shrinkage. So make sure you're always using a wet cloth, dry cloth type of process when cleaning your panel when you have exposed body filler. Now that the panel is all cleaned, we're ready to mask this up. Depending on the type of repair that you're working on and your shop's processes, masking can look a lot of different ways. Some people will use paper, some will use foam. In this case, since this was a fender that had all kinds of scratches and stuff around the repair area, we know that we're going to have to blend into the next panel. So in this instance, you may not mask at all because we know we're going to sand everything after. The biggest thing when we're masking is we want to make sure we keep a soft edge. We don't want a hard edge where the primer stops. There's a few ways of doing that. The first is with paper. What you want to do is apply the paper so it's actually over the repair area, and then we're going to fold it back so the paper has a nice rounded edge. So that would look something like this. So we have a nice open edge here against our panel. That's going to ensure that our primer doesn't leave a hard line if we get too close to that masking. The other way to do this, especially on large primer jobs, is with foam. We can outline the area with foam, and that foam is curved and will also provide a nice soft edge. This is what foam looks like when it's applied to the panel. As you can see, it's not pushed tightly against, it has a little bit of movement to it, so as I prime, that primer can lay down and leave that smooth edge that we're looking for. In this case, I'm going to use the paper method, so I'm going to pull this stuff off, grab my masking materials, and fully mask around the area. So now I have my masking paper applied. Again, notice that I rolled the paper back to leave a nice soft edge around my repair. So if I go too far with any of my coats of primer, I'm not going to get a hard edge that's going to be really hard to sand out later. Now that we're masked up, we're ready to move this into the booth and spray. In the next video, we're going to pull this panel into the booth and do our primer application. Thank you for watching. Be sure to comment, share, and subscribe. And for more content like this, be sure to check us out online at 3M Collision Repair Academy, a link to which can be found in the description below.